Welcome back everyone, I'm Robius, and today I bring you the fourth episode in the revival series of Assassin's Creed: The Real History. In these videos, I take you back through the Assassin's Creed games, reviewing the actual history of a depicted individual, and then compare it to the game's narrative. For that reason, please be aware of a spoiler alert for this entire video. In this episode, we'll be evaluating the representation of the Major General, considered the technical second-in-command of the Continental Army, Charles Lee, who was featured heavily in Assassin's Creed 3 and made a brief appearance in Rogue. To start, let's discuss Lee's history prior to his introduction in the Assassin's Creed franchise. Born in England on February 6, 1732, Charles Lee was the son of John Lee, a Major General, and his wife Isabella. His father's social standing meant he was well educated, after which he proved himself an adept polyglot, learning French, Greek, and Latin among other languages. Furthermore, Charles was introduced to the military life in 1747 when his father made him an ensign within the regiment he commanded. The young Lee served in Ireland, becoming a lieutenant in 1751. Years later, in 1754, his regiment was reassigned to serve under Major General Edward Bradock within the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, often referred to as the French and Indian War. This would be the point in history where Charles Lee was first introduced to the players in Assassin's Creed 3. In the game, while serving under Bradock, Lee became familiar with the fictional iteration of the Templar Order. Seeking involvement, he was tasked with aiding the invented character of Haytham Kenway, which Bradock, also a member of the Templars, resentfully allowed. This entire portion of the game involved a series of fictional missions in which Lee helped gather the Templar allies together. In actuality, in this time Charles did serve under Bradock, eventually participating in his 1755 expedition, which culminated in a British defeat in the Battle of the Monongahela. According to Assassin's Creed, the collapse of this expedition was caused by Haytham Kenway, his Templar allies, and a joint French and Iroquois force. Just as the battle began, French troops led by the commander Daniel Lignard de Beaujeu charged towards the British. Lee, seeing that Kenway was in danger, took a shot and killed the French captain. Eventually, Haytham was successful in mortally wounding Bradock, who died days later. For his actions, Lee was formally inducted into the Templar Order. Historically speaking, Charles was present for the end of the Bradock expedition, but is not credited for killing Captain Beaujeu, who was instead generally said to have died from the first shots fired. According to records, Lee eventually befriended the local Mohawk and was adopted into their tribe, marrying one of the chief's daughters, with whom he had twins. Charles was known in the tribe's native tongue as Boiling Water due to his temper and short fuse. Using his wealth, Lee later acquired a captain's position in June of 1756. In Assassin's Creed Rogue, he is briefly seen in 1757 after the death of their comrade, Colonel George Monroe, during the initiation of his replacement, the former assassin, Shay Cormac. Historically, Lee joined the failed British expedition against the French fortress of Louisbourg and Fort Carillon, where he was injured. After recovering, Charles joined the excursions that saw British victories at Fort Niagara in 1759 and Montreal in 1760. These final conflicts were paramount in concluding the French and Indian War with a British victory. This leads to the fictional point in Assassin's Creed 3, where Lee and his allies searched for a Mohawk village, wishing to speak with their elders. Instead, they found the young Bradock, who refused to divulge the location. The Templars soon abandoned their efforts, with Washington's forces instead discovering and burning down the village due to a suspected alliance between the Mohawk and the French. Bradock's mother was killed in the blaze, which set the child on a long path for justice against Lee, whom he mistakenly thought organized the attack. In reality, Charles actually returned to England in 1760, and his regiment was disbanded. Receiving a promotion to major, he then sought further prestige by joining campaigns in Portugal and Poland. In this time, he lost parts of 2 fingers in a duel where he killed his adversary. When his return to Britain was met with a lack of a promotion, Lee became critical towards the establishment. Assassin's Creed has Lee returning to the colonies in 1770, where he sparked the Boston Massacre by firing the first shot and getting the British Guards to open fire on the protesters. In reality, Charles did not return to the colonies until 1773, at which point he purchased an estate and became involved in the Patriot movement, meeting sympathizers, gaining popularity, and recommending they respond to British hostility by forming a colonial army. Although the game depicts Charles as being present during the Boston Tea Party, opposing the actions of the Sons of Liberty who were aided by Connor, this is completely fictional. In fact, despite not being involved or present, Lee is thought to have supported this protest. With the mounting tensions and war on the horizon, Charles resigned from the British Army and joined the Continental Army in 1775. Being among the highest-ranked colonial officers, Lee expected to be named Commander-in-Chief and was disgusted when Congress instead decided on Washington, whom they preferred since he was local, a steady leader, and didn't request much pay. In contrast, Lee was seen as an arrogant, disheveled, coarse commander from Britain who expected a very high pay as compensation for all the English properties he forfeited upon joining. Instead, he was made third in command of the Continental Army, although, since Artemas Ward held more of an inactive position, Major General Charles Lee was essentially second in command to Washington. Washington's acceptance ceremony was depicted in Assassin's Creed 3 and showed Lee in the back contemptuously criticizing him.
Truly, there is no man better suited to the task.
Really? I can think of several.
In truth, Lee's appointment is usually attributed to the support he received from the future President of the United States, John Adams, and his cousin, Samuel Adams, who both admired Lee's political views and reputation. Lee later served alongside Washington in Boston, contributing to the Patriots' efforts in some early conflicts, but was eventually sent to fortify their Charleston position. When the British arrived, Charles ordered the evacuation of Fort Sullivan, but this was forbidden by the governor. The Continental forces remained and successfully repelled the British. Despite not being the main organizer of this defense, Lee was recognized as the hero of Charleston. He later returned to Washington's side in New York, for which the commander-in-chief renamed Fort Constitution to Fort Lee as a sign of his appreciation. Although Lee's reputation grew, so did his disdain for Washington, of whom he actively wrote criticizing letters to Congress in the hopes that they would replace him as commander-in-chief. It is said Washington accidentally received one of these letters, but, despite being disappointed, he did not seek retribution. In Assassin's Creed 3's story, the Templars plotted to assassinate George Washington, thus making Charles Lee the replacement commander-in-chief. Although certain historians believe there to have been an actual assassination plot that may have involved the soldier Thomas Hickey, there has never been any correlation between this plot and Lee. Nevertheless, following the loss of New York, Washington was forced to order an evacuation to Pennsylvania. Lee, in an apparent act of defiance, set a slow marching pace for his men. On the night of December 12th, Charles and his guards did not stay with their army, but instead slept at a tavern 3 miles away. The next morning, they were met by a British patrol which took Lee prisoner. The general remained in British hands for over a year. It was discovered, nearly 100 years later, that to avoid being tried for desertion because he accepted a commission in the Continental Army before resigning from the British Army, in 1777, Lee drafted plans for military operations that the British could launch against the Continental Army. Within AC-3, Lee wanted to be captured so that he could feed the British information in hopes they would disgrace Washington in battle. Ultimately, in both interpretations, Lee was eventually exchanged for the captured general Richard Prescott. Once a free man, Charles returned to service. The game had him mobilize native forces against the Continental Army, but this never actually happened. In reality, by June of 1778, the Battle of Monmouth approached, and Washington begrudgingly offered Lee the role of second-in-command to his forces. When Charles displayed reluctance towards the offer, the Marquis de Lafayette was placed in charge, until Lee suddenly changed his mind and had their French ally relinquish control. Washington's orders were to strike the British rear guard as they retreated. However, it is said when they returned fire, Lee ordered a retreat. Lafayette, dumbfounded by these actions, sent a messenger to Washington. Lee's forces, in retreat, ran right into Washington's advancing troops. In front of their armies, the commander-in-chief disciplined and disgraced Lee, in a rare instance where he swore publicly. Charles responded with insubordination and was therefore arrested. In the game, Connor saves the Continental Army from collapsing by supporting Lafayette's efforts. The pair then revealed Lee's purposeful betrayal to Washington, as was the narrative in the game. Although it was worth noting that some historians have postulated that this may have been his actual intention. Charles took great offense to Washington's comments and allegations, demanding a proper court-martial clear his name. Washington complied, and, in July of 1778, Lee was found guilty of disobeying orders, misbehaving before the enemy, and disrespecting the commander-in-chief. In his defense, Charles stated he thought he was outnumbered 2-1 and that the retreat was reasonable. It was countered that this conflict was meant to test his troops' new training provided by their Prussian allies. In addition, it was clarified there was no excuse for disobeying his orders or disrespecting the commander-in-chief, which led him to be relieved of command for a year. Charles tried and failed to have Congress overturn the court-martial's decision. Thereafter, he began to publicly attack Washington's character and was subsequently challenged by many of the man's supporters to duels. In one case, he was severely injured. In 1780, Lee was officially discharged from service in the Continental Army. Essentially, the majority of the events that followed in Assassin's Creed 3 were entirely fictional. The game has Connor hunting Lee at Fort George, then at Hatham's funeral, and eventually finding him at the Boston Pier while trying to flee to England. A chase ensued in the dockyards, both men fell, and as Charles got the upper hand, Connor shot him. The wounded Lee fled, boarded a ferry, and later rested at the Conestoga Inn. Ultimately, Connor tracked down the Templar. Too hurt to run any longer, Lee shared his drink with the assassin, who killed him immediately afterwards. Unfortunately, this entire cinematic sequence was completely fictionalized. In reality, after his discharge, Lee returned to his estate and lived there for a few years, and eventually faced financial difficulties. In 1782, Charles visited Philadelphia and stayed at the same tavern, later developing a fever and dying of it on October 2nd, 1782. Moving on, we've now reached the final chapter of the video. From here on, we will review everything we've learned about Charles Lee so far, based on his lengthy appearance in Assassin's Creed 3 and minor cameo in Rogue, with the purpose of comparing his depiction to his documented history. Let's start by listing off the major fictional aspects which were introduced into the games. Charles Lee was not involved with this iteration of the Templar Order, he did not instigate the Boston Massacre, nor was he a participant in a potential plot to assassinate Washington, and lastly, his death was not at the hands of Connor. In terms of lesser variations, it can be said that despite his presence during the Bradock expedition, he was not involved in Edward Braddock's death, nor is he confirmed as being the individual who shot Captain Beaujeu. In addition, there aren't any records of Lee accosting the Mohawk during his travels in colonial America, or opposing the Boston Tea Party after it occurred. On a final minor note, Charles is also said to have lost parts of 2 fingers in a duel during his European campaigns. With all this information in mind, let's talk about the portions of his life the game got right, and how Lee's actual history was merged with certain fictional components. Aside from his apparent presence in the colonies during the Boston Massacre, it can be said Lee's game appearances chronologically matched his travels between North America and Europe. In addition, his military talents and utter disdain for George Washington were very well represented throughout the games. Lastly, I liked how his death still occurred suddenly while staying in a tavern, despite the fact that his actual death was brought about by illness and not an assassin's blade. Having said all that, let's talk about whether or not he was fairly represented in the game. In all honesty, this is a tricky one. In many ways, he was well depicted, but in other aspects, his portrayal was skewed. The tale of a brash, intelligent, and ambitious general whose own actions and spite led to his self-destruction was very well highlighted. Both Lee's contemporaries and critics noted his crass behavior, his penchant for drinking, his messy appearance, and his general vulgarity, which definitely translated into the character we saw in the game. However, on the other hand, it would seem the game purposefully demonized Lee further, concentrating mainly on his negative aspects and inflating these to turn him into the archetypal villain. In a lot of ways, the individual's personality appears to have been split between 2 characters, with Charles keeping all of the dark and negative qualities, while the fictional Hatham Kenway adopted many of the man's more positive attributes in terms of his commanding presence, his good relationship with the Mohawk, and his strategic thinking. Another complaint echoed by players is that Lee was depicted almost like a racist in the game, which is argued as being unfair due to his good relationship with the Mohawk, his adoption by the tribe, and his marriage to the chief's daughter with whom he fathered twins. Nevertheless, the last point I'd like to discuss is the major shift we see in Charles Lee's representation from his initial introduction from 1754 to 1760 and his changed appearance upon his return a decade later from 1770 onwards. First, it's worth mentioning that Lee's change in outfits was a nice nod to his history, as it is noted he would often wear his uniforms from his European campaigns that he acquired between his 2 appearances. Next, although the historical timeline isn't completely clear, in his later life, Lee is confirmed as appearing generally unkempt and slovenly, rarely cleaning his uniforms and fundamentally rejecting the conventions that dictated an officer's attire. This extended to his rash, vulgar, and unprofessional behavior. One last component I'd like to discuss is a theory that gained a lot of popularity when explaining Lee's sudden shift in image. This theory postulates that the change is based on the fictional character the player is controlling. In the first portion of the game, the player controls Hatham, who perceives Charles Lee as a reliable, professional ally, whereas in the second portion of the game, when playing Connor, the player sees him as an evil, deranged racist. Although I'm not sure if that was the intention of the game, I found it an interesting idea. With this information in hand, you may make your own conclusions on whether or not you feel Charles Lee was well represented in the game, as I hold rather mixed views on the matter. In any case, this concludes the 4th episode in the revival series of Assassin's Creed: The Real History. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the video, I'd like to ask that you please share this series with your friends. Should you have any requests for a future video topic, whether it be an individual, an event, or something else from the Assassin's Creed franchise, please let me know in the comment section. As always, my sources for making this video can be found in the description bar below. Thanks for watching.